Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to American Zarathustra. We have a very, very special feature for you this evening. I am extremely pleased to welcome back a good friend and an amazing guy, Dave Martel. How are you today, Dave?
I'm doing excellent, Mr. Don. Thank you for having me.
Awesome, awesome. So, as people can see on the screen, you have recently published a book of weird tales of monsters, magic, and machines called The Bizarchives. And cue music right there. So we're going to talk about that today. I think a lot of people know I did the cover art for it. Dave and I are both huge fans of this genre, of the medium of some pulp novels, comics, graphic novels, science fiction, cosmic horror. All of these things kind of mixed together. So it's going to be a really fun show to just kind of talk through what's in the book that's being published. I understand it's doing well in sales. Dave did a little review on his own show talking about the different stories. We'll review that a bit. And then we're also going to kind of go back into this whole kind of history of illustrated stories that inspired both Dave and I in our own paths to do this kind of work. So it's a really exciting field. It's an exciting topic. Lots of cool stuff to nerd out on. I'm going to be showing a lot of great artwork in the show. So, stick around, get your popcorn. Here we go. So, Dave, tell us, what was the origin of the Bizarchives? How did you come to start this project?
Well, I was, as I said before in a previous stream, I was very much inspired by, your project, the Imperium Art, the idea behind Imperium Art and, White Art Collective. And there's a little project that comes out of the Imperium Press spheres called Destagnation, and they have a lot of philosophy behind that. And I was just very much inspired by all of these folks that are calling for art, new art that represents our folk and our people, and something new and fresh and all of that. And my entire life, I have loved fantasy, science fiction, cosmic horror. We're going to talk about Heavy Metal Magazine later on. Just all of these really, really great literary and artistic traditions that are kind of modern, but they in themselves are very Americana and had a lot of influence across the world, and then branched out and proliferated into pretty much all entertainment today, which we're probably going to talk about. But I was inspired by those things that like the ideas that you were putting forth, Mr. Don, and what the folks at White Art Collective are doing. And like I said, the Destagnation from the Imperium Press crew. And I looked all around, and, my show, The Bog, we talk a lot about ancestral faith and theology, and we do some philosophy and history. And I absolutely love those things. And all around the spheres, there are so many smart guys that are doing so many different things. Like, there's guys that are doing philosophy and social critiques and just all over the place with all of this smart stuff covering politics and political theory. And I'm just sitting here like, I want to fill a niche. I want to do something that folks haven't covered yet. And I'm sitting around looking, I'm like, I'm not seeing a whole lot of fiction going on. And when you think about fiction is the stuff that folks, the average people out there, are the most outraged about. Like most recently, the new He-Man that came out, I was astounded at how absolutely angry people were about that, because it is a heaving piece of crap. It was terrible. But the average folks, the guys that loved He-Man as kids, were like so angry they were ready to fight people about it.
Yeah. Tell me about it, man. Growing up a comics nerd and watching how Marvel and DC have just like transformed into like degenerate garbage, the cross racialism, the smashing of our myths, and this all it's been weaponized against us culturally. And that we literally are in a culture war. This is the battlefield we fight on. Let me first say that you're having been inspired by the White Art Collective and Imperium Art is something that means so much to me I can't even really put it in words. This is part of what we do, and why we do what we do is to inspire more growth in our community. And I mean, what better person than yourself, with your energy, your background, your vision. It's just fabulous. I can't say really enough. I'm very excited about it. Lord Wolfshield from the White Art Collective is in the chat. He got the book, says loving it so far. And so I'm really pleased with the way things are going. It's on Amazon. We'll be looking at that. The link to the book will be in the show notes a little bit later. But I'm just kind of like, giving you a standing ovation for that. I'm very, very pleased.
Thank you so much.
Inspired. Yeah. But I'd like it if you could talk more about this thing from Imperium Press. What's it called?
They call it destagnation, and it's kind of in the vein of Imperium art. It's this idea that to be a living people, to have vitality, you must also create new things, right? Things must continue on, and they have a whole big philosophy behind it.
Okay.
So if anybody's interested, they go over to the Imperium Press and ask them. I'm sure they'll give you a whole big introduction into it. But it's really, really fascinating stuff, really big brain stuff. But I was, that really sparked it off for me, and I was like, I'm not really as smart as some of these guys that do the philosophy stuff. Some of these guys have degrees and have been reading this stuff for years and years. I dabble in it. I was like, what can I put on the table? What can I put on the table that is my thing, that is my contribution to all of these ideas, whether it be White Art Collective, Imperium Art, or Destagnation, that are all kind of calling for the same thing. And I was like, I want to do what I know the most about, which is science fiction, fantasy, and cosmic horror. That was like, that's my shtick. Pulp Fiction has been something that I've loved my whole life. And I was like, let's get started on this. So I put out a thing, and I said, if anybody's ever thought about being an author, I've got this project going. It's very much in the vein of the old Weird Tales magazine. So if you're into H.P. Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard or anything in between, Clark Ashton Smith, give me a shout. Let's see if we can put this together. And I was astounded. I couldn't believe how many talented people really just like reached out, like they were dying for somewhere to put this. And then as I'm talking to these guys, I come to find out that a lot of these guys are seasoned writers, or they're writers that have been trying to take a stab into the industry. And as we said before the show, the current industry of fiction, whether it be literary or it's movies or music or any of the arts nowadays, are just completely, they're just like clutched by these horrible gatekeepers, these the postmodernists, the who's that we're talking about, that if they know, if you're a straight white male and you put in a story, they don't even want you. They don't want you, regardless of how good your story or your work might be. They just don't want you. And and that stuck in my craw. And I was like, guys like me that love this kind of stuff. And the pulp tradition is our tradition. The pulp fiction is our thing. It always has been.
It's very Americana, very Americana. I'm going through Pulp Fiction covers right now, and there's an interesting crossover into film as well. The film noir genre and Pulp Fiction are completely like family members, cousins or brothers, siblings of some kind. And there's also a lot of you've got these kind of like amazing stories with science fiction. You've got war stories, horror. Here's Argosy is one of the oldest and most classic magazines that was put out, and these were short stories that were, I can't give you the exact year that this was out, but this was the normal entertainment for common people. You had radio shows and you had Pulp Fiction magazines. They were the kind of laid the foundation for the comic book industry. And a lot of the artists from the Pulp Fiction cover industry, if you will, they moved on to doing comics a bit later. So it's quite fun and quite fascinating to see the history and the evolution of the art form as well. There's obviously a lot of adult stuff. There's sort of, maybe, and some comedy and some campy things. There's, of course, a lot of the Westerns. It's just wonderful. It's a time in America that I think we all probably look at somewhat nostalgically. Our people were in charge. Our people were unashamed about who they are and what they do. And, it was just an exciting time of imagination. The future is going to have flying cars, not, rainbow flags over embassies and stuff like that. But it's a huge topic. And so how would you say that Bizarchives is in some way in this slot here in the genre of pulp fiction?
Well, when we talk about pulp fiction is kind of it's hard to define. It really is, because as you mentioned earlier, it really started out. The seeds were planted in the late 1800s, believe it or not, with guys like Edgar Rice Burroughs, who did the Barsoom series, and he was also the creator of Tarzan. But then it really came to life in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And this is referred to as the golden era of fiction. And when we go to school, what do we learn about? We learn about Catcher in the Rye, The Great Gatsby, and we're told that these are the greatest literary works ever in the history of America, blah, 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 blah. But in actuality, this was the time of the Great Depression. This is the time of the World War I, going into World War II. This is a time of scarcity and starvation. And like, this was a tough time, man. People were hungry back then. If they did work, this was before there were child labor laws. This was before labor laws, period. So you had folks that were working just insane hours, working, getting hurt at work and having to continue to work it and paid peanuts. And then the inflated prices of it. This is a tough time to be alive. So folks didn't go buy The Great Gatsby or The Grapes of Wrath or anything like that. Number one, because these hardback books were too expensive. They couldn't afford them. And number two, they wanted something that was that appealed to their imagination. Yeah. So when pulp came out, first of all, it's called pulp because of the type of paper that it was printed on. It was printed on paper that was pressed from the excess wood pulp that was made from making regular paper. So it was this really cheap tissue paper.
Like you would think of like newsprint type paper, real raw, cheap paper. But yeah.
Yeah. So it was like folks were buying, and they called them dime novels because they cost between a nickel and a quarter. And folks would pick these up, they'd read them, they'd trade them, and they were full of these short stories. And more importantly, this also created a form of revenue for people back then, because a lot of these authors, they had nothing. They had no opportunities at all. And their only way to feed their family was they would pull out their typewriters, they would type until their fingers would fall off. There was actually a joke back then that they would say that to be a pulp author, they would sell typewriters that would come with a bottle of whiskey. That's how much these guys would type. Their hands would hurt so bad they'd have to drink to get the pain down. So this was a huge cultural thing, and to put it into perspective, and I say this in the preface of the Bizarchives, where I kind of throw shade at what we consider to be American classics. The Great Gatsby, from when it came out, I believe, in 1926 until Fitzgerald died in the 30s, it sold a total of 30,000 copies through like 12 years that it was out.
Wow.
Weird Tales magazine would sell 100,000 copies in a month. 30,000 for the entire time of Fitzgerald's life when the book was out versus 100,000 in a month. And Weird Tales wasn't even the biggest one. There were, like you mentioned, Argosy. You have Amazing Stories. There were ones out there that were far bigger than Weird Tales. So that's how important pulp fiction was to people. Now, when we talk about the genres of pulp fiction, first it started out, you had a lot of detective noir stories, Dick Tracy kind of stuff. And you also had a lot of Westerns. And then you had a lot of war dramas, stuff about World War I fighter pilots like Red Baron and so forth. And then you also had like romances and things like that. And these were, wildly popular. But later on, when you get into the late 20s and then into the mid 30s, you started to see stuff emerge like Weird Tales, where you get into some of the horror things and monsters and fantasy, it's sword and sorcery and just science fiction and stuff. Because science fiction was a lot of people don't realize science fiction has been around since the 1800s. You know what I mean? So a lot of these authors was it H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, these The War of the Worlds, Journey to the Center of the Earth, this kind of stuff, what came out from Pulp Fiction. So Pulp Fiction was immensely influential from everything from Westerns to mafia movies to anything you could think of. If you go back and you watch, you go check out the titles from the spaghetti Westerns that we all love. Clint. Everybody loves Clint. Everybody loves Lee Van Cleef. The titles like The Good, Bad, and the Ugly, like Fistful of Dollars, and like this kind of stuff. These are titles. The format of these titles were taken directly from Pulp Fiction.
This is the biggest issue that we're talking about here, is that people are disconnected from that. I think the one kind of connection that most people would know would be Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's clearly drawn straight off the pages of that time in those magazines. That kind of the rugged individualist going out into other cultures that were facing all sorts of dangers. And it's funny because if you were to look, I just recently saw that on TV, and I remember thinking like this would never pass today, because like the way that people from other cultures are depicted is so like kind of cartoonish and stereotypical, and they're all evil essentially, right? They're all savages and all this kind of stuff. But it is a wonderful literary tradition that everything we know up until a certain point is built off of. Now we're in a degenerate age, right? Yeah. It's all about destroying that. And I can't pronounce the guy's name. He directed Thor 3, the Jojo Rabbit movie. He's literally said, "I hate America," and yet he gets more and more like high profile film director positions, especially in kind of like Marvel Comics and that kind of field of movies. And he knows exactly how to undermine the myths and make women into men and humiliate the gods and blah blah blah. Like all this shit is just like it tears me up. It makes me so angry.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's cutting us off literally from this history that we're talking about, this literary history. So you're doing this is enormous. I can't really overstate like how important it is that you're reconnecting us with this these adventures, this fanciful, and genre isn't the word, right? Because you've got every genre within a certain type of magazine format, I guess, if you will. So that's magical. There's just a lot of really, really neat stuff to look at. So let's talk a little bit more about your the book collection, the Bizarchives itself. Maybe you can kind of run through a couple of the different stories.
Sure, absolutely. I actually forgot my copy, so we're just going to see if I can remember them all off the top of the head. So the Bizarchives, it covers quite a few different genres that kind of go under the umbrella of Pulp Fiction. Okay. We have the authors themselves. Half of us are American, the other half are English, believe it or not. A lot of our English friends from across the pond were really interested in getting in with this, and so we have quite a few. And it ranges from many different genres. It starts out with the first story in the book is called The Kirioth of Drewbury Moor, and that's written by a guy named Robert C. Booth, and he's a proper Englishman, and this is a story about spooky English folklore, about some sort of like fae entity, like some sort of like a banshee type thing, like from Welsh folklore. And there's kind of like this little team of investigators that have to go check it out, and it's kind of has a little bit of taste of cosmic horror in there, but it's very very English flavored folkloric horror kind of story. Very very well written, very cool. I have two stories in there. One of them is called Lex and the Lost Girl, and this is a story about a character named Lucius Lex, and Lucius Lex is effectively grimdark Conan, and Yeah, he's like, he lives in a world that is completely just dominated by monsters and demons and
Oh,
horrible, awful things. And
yeah.
his entire goal is to go around and just massacre monsters. He's got a little bit of magic powers. He gets
Mm,
in these hyper violent fight scenes.
nice.
It's a very action oriented kind of thing.
Awesome. Awesome.
My other story I have in there is called They Never Woke Up, which is set in a sci-fi universe that I just call Dome, and it's a
Mm,
very short story. It's about 1,200 words, and it's pretty much a story about these folks that have to live in domes because Earth has become an irradiated red planet, and they live
mm,
in these domes. However, it's so far in the future that they forgot what they call the ancient world or the
mm,
antediluvian world. But to
mm.
them, the antediluvian world is our modern world today. So they go on these archaeological digs to learn about the ancient world, and they're digging up like a grill from like a Chevy Nova, or they'll find like an iPod, or just like very basic mundane things from our time now, and they investigate it like it's incredible. But in this world, there is all kinds of monsters, like pretty much the genetics of the wildlife on Earth has been so perverted that everything's trying to eat them. There's a rogue AI unit that births human beings, that assembles their genetics based on
Right.
purpose and births human beings out of these brood pods. And it's
Yeah.
just like, it's a crazy sci-fi setting. So I have a
Mhm,
story in there.
mhm,
We have a story from another Englishman named A. Cuthbertson, who's also going to have a novella with us. And
mhm.
his story in there is called Tanner's Gold. That's a very cool cosmic horror story. We also have some sci fantasy kind of stuff, some more lighthearted stuff. One of the stories is called The White Dragon, from a guy named M.S. Jones. We have some what I would call mage punk, which is like a cyberpunk
Oh,
fantasy mashup where there's like ship battles and guys are using magic, and like there's all
wow.
kinds of cool stuff in there, man. Lots of cool stuff.
That is a very clap. When people do stuff like that, I think, man, why didn't I think of that? Like
Yeah.
mage cyberpunk. Like, yeah, why not? Yeah, of course. I think that's part of the fun of it too, is seeing what can be mashed up. I recently was in a bookstore looking through children's books as I'm getting more interested in doing that. And there's just all kinds of just silly, wacky mashups, like dinosaurs versus aliens, like stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
And like that's the thing, is that I think we all really have a spirit of a child in us, let's say most of us, and we want that excitement, we want the adventure, we want imagination, we want something that will stimulate us. And I feel that living in and growing up in a culture filled with like hyper imagination is super, super healthy for brain development, really at any stage in your life. It excites you in a way. It expands your vision and your experience of reality even. And of course, we know that a lot of technology was born out of science fiction. You look at old episodes of Star Trek, and now you've got cell phones and stuff and various
Yeah.
other. So just so many exciting things to talk about. First of all, I also want to say that I'm excited that you're working a lot with our brothers over in Britain, across the pond. The White Art Collective and the someone's going to have to help me in the chat. Patriotic. It's in the patriotic alternative sphere, but
Yep.
the Patriotic Arts, I think it's called.
Yep.
Yeah, they've got, in a sense, it's basically White Art Collective in Britain, and they're doing their own thing. They have, like, I guess, monthly sort of themes that they work on, and that thing is just taking off. I understand they're Mark Collette's trying to set up some kind of a music festival. White Art Collective had a music festival in May. That was a major event. So our cultures are growing, and exponentially. There's a lot of momentum here, and you just like put some rocket fuel in that momentum in the tank there with what you're doing. How can people reach out to you to submit for the next issue?
Well, for the next issue, the deadline for that will be on November 1st, but we accept submissions all the time. You can send a submission to thebizarchives@gmail.com, and kind of the basic criteria for the story is it must be within the pulp genres. We prefer the kind of weirder, darker side of things, but if you want to put in a Western or a detective story or something like that, and it's a good story, we're not going to turn you away. So you send an email, send your submission in doc format, no PDFs, doc format, Times New Roman. It must be between 1 and 6,000 words, and email it to the bizarchives@gmail.com, and make sure you have either your name or your pseudonym or whatever, because we had the problem that people were kind of like, they didn't want to put just write anonymous there. If you write anonymous there, we'll publish it as anonymous, but put it in there and we will put it in the submissions. We'll take a read, and if it needs any sort of repairs or anything like that, we'll reach out to you, because we're very much in this to help people become more polished in their craft, because there's so many talented writers out there that didn't have the chance to go to college or didn't have a chance to get higher learning, because higher learning doesn't want us anymore. So we are taking it upon ourselves to help guys with their grammar and their spelling and their punctuation. And it might sound kind of silly, but it helps a lot to polish your skills and your craft in these areas and to become a better writer. We pretty much want to reclaim this tradition, this specific literary tradition that we love and is so special to us, and then turn it around and push it back out into the zeitgeist and take it back by force.
Beautiful. I love it. I can see you right now holding a huge Conan axe, the double-bladed axe, and like maybe some mead dripping off your beard or something. Yeah. With a chesty woman behind you and ready.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, so Budgie Burger in the chat said the patriotic arts community. So I believe that's what it is. We thank you. And I'll try to put a link into that as well. It's just really important that our community is communicating with each other, that we're sharing and consuming the arts and our culture together. We're communicating across the pond. We're just power in numbers. This is our culture. We're kind of like a rock in a storm. So there's a lot of negative stuff around us, and the more we turn inward and we look at our own artists, musicians, poets, etc., then the more moralized, the stronger we become. We shake off that kind of negative coating that is sprayed on us every day through TV and movies and music and all that negative anti-white stuff that we have to cope with.
Yeah, exactly. And what I would say to people is, if something that you love is contaminated and perverted, and you better believe anything that you like that is some sort of setting or movie or book series or anything out there, that they're eventually going to get their hands on it, and they're going to contaminate it and they're going to destroy it. So what I would say to people is, instead of say, oh well, that's destroyed, but make your own. You don't need permission.
Yeah.
Did they destroy Star Wars? All right, well, make your own Star Wars and write it.
Yeah.
Make your own.
You nailed it. So earlier you were talking about Robert E. Howard and many other great authors. I've got Conan up on the screen here. I would say that, this is one of the primary or primal figures of kind of like, sort of like the male archetype in our time. Very fascinating story about Robert E. Howard is that my understanding is that he believes that he channeled these stories from a past life in like Lemuria or some kind of other time. I don't know if you're familiar with that or how, what to say about that exactly, but I find that he would just sit down and type, it would just flow out of him. Normally when you're writing a story, you have to plot it out, you've got to, beginning, middle, end, character designs, and how you resolve a conflict, all this stuff. But he would just type. He'd sit down and go, and the whole thing would just flow out of him. What do you? What are your thoughts on Robert E. Howard and Conan?
Well, first of all, my thoughts are Conan is like the best character ever, and Robert E. Howard is like one of my favorite authors of all time, and I've been obsessed with the Conan universe and the Hyborian Age for like
Mhm.
years and years. I absolutely love it. If you have not dug into the Conan setting, you are missing
Mhm.
out. It is so based. It's violent.
Mhm.
It's manly. There's so many like Hyperborean themes in there.
Yeah.
It's
Ah,
like race
yeah.
realism. Like it's like it's
Yeah.
really awesome stuff. But
Yeah.
you mentioned about how he believed he was channeling it from like a previous age. The thing is about Robert E. Howard is Robert E. Howard was a very intuitive, poetic kind of guy. So a lot of times when he quotes get attributed to him,
Mm.
they have some nuance. Now, Robert E. Howard was also a guy that was very self-educated, very well educated in
Mm.
science and archaeology and stuff like this. He was a brilliant man, genius IQ man. So
Mm.
he had letters going back and forth with other authors where he spoke more plainly, and he said he does not believe in the alternative history of the Theosophists.
Wow.
He finds that it is very imaginative and creative, and it helped
Okay.
inspire him to create Hyboria. But as far as believing that it actually exists, he sort of created like an alternative. Robert E. Howard was really the first author to be a full-on world builder, and he
Mm.
created this alternative history stuff with like the
Mm.
Picts were the first people, and they migrated here, and you had the Atlanteans and the Lemurians, and
Mhm.
all of these different. They were the first race and the second race and the third race, and he kind of created his own. But it was really brilliant how he did it, and his characters are just off the charts, so good. He
Mm.
had Call the Conqueror. You
I
have
love Paul.
obviously Conan, and then
Yeah.
one of his lesser known ones was Solomon Kane,
Mm.
and all of these guys um, live in different ages
Yeah.
of his universe. You have like the Atlantean age where Call was from, and then you have the Hyborian age where Conan was from, and then you had the I forget what the age you called it, but then you had the later age with Solomon Kane, and Solomon Kane was like this Puritan former pirate that repented into his faith, and he fought vampires and demons because he knew that his soul was ultimately damned to hell. He was kind of like the proto Spawn mixed with Constantine mixed with Van Helsing. He was like all of these characters in one, and he was very brilliant too. But Conan, everything from the story, he started out with his first Conan story ever published was called The Devil in Iron, and then he went on to write so many more, and then even more got published after his death. Because Robert E. Howard, like his friend H.P. Lovecraft, was kind of a tragic figure. He was a very he was a very brilliant man, and he was kind of a tortured soul. He really truly was. He
Mm.
grew up in rural Texas. He was from, I believe, his family. His father was a butcher, and his mom was from a um like a very well-to-do aristocratic family, and
Mhm.
she kind of married down, so she was very
Okay.
she was kind of an abusive mother to him. But he developed this kind of, and she got very sick very early, and he acted as her caretaker. So he developed this like toxic codependent relationship with his mother, and
Mm.
he was extremely high IQ. And early in his life, he was a very athletic guy. He was a big, powerful guy. He
Yeah.
was said to be he like very early on mastered the skills of boxing and wrestling,
Mhm.
and
Right.
he loved violence and sword fighting, and he
Mhm.
was like he was also very much into so many other like he was a scholar and an athlete and a warrior. He was just an incredible guy, but because he had this really toxic family life, his mother passed away, and unfortunately, Mr. Robert E. Howard took his own life at the age of 30. Very,
That's
very young. Very
that's
sad story.
God. I mean, can you imagine how much more he could have produced in his life? This is one of my biggest problems with creative people, in a sense, is that it's so sad and so tragic that they have amazing vision and skill and talent. And that's a problem with being an artist, is you feel things so much more intensely than I guess the average person in some way. That's kind of the nature of it. That's hard. That's part of the passion of making art. What else would make you work so hard to take a chance on, whatever it is that you're making, that, maybe you'll make a living from it, or maybe you don't even care. You just want to, or you need to get these stories out, get the vision out, whatever that might be. And, I just think it's extraordinary how much he did live his life. Maybe he lived like 3 lives in one lifetime in 30 years. The man is really extraordinary, an American hero, and somebody that we really should kind of revive, I'd say, and respect in the white positive sphere for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've worked with other authors that are like crazy about Robert E. Howard, and specifically, of course, Conan. I grew up with Conan comics as well. That was always a big, cool part of my day, and I could go grab a comic book. Here's the thing, is that a lot of people who didn't grow up with it or aren't really familiar with it, the medium of comics, okay, they've got like a bit of a prejudice where they think, oh, comics are for kids, they're all about superheroes, and it's not really my thing. Whereas comics are film on paper. They're illustrated stories.
Yeah.
And there's very many kind of awesome, phenomenal artists and art styles. And when you just see that it's film on paper, you can reapproach the medium in a way that will like remove that prejudice or bias and allow you to enjoy it. So you can go to any library or any bookstore and just peruse the graphic novel section, and you'll find all kinds of cool stuff. Now, another little side story. There's a guy named Roy Thomas who took over as editor-in-chief at Marvel Comics, sort of during and after Stan Lee. And so Roy Thomas is really, really known, among other things, I guess, for his writing Conan the Barbarian, the comics. And I really strongly feel his style is extremely true to the voice of Robert E. Howard. He doesn't pull any punches. You could tell he's like an authentic fan of Robert E. Howard, and that in order to translate the Pulp Fiction novels to comics, he would have to replicate that voice and that style and those themes in the comics. So I actually had a chance to talk with Roy Thomas many years ago, and unfortunately, we were gonna work together on a future Conan story.
Really?
Conan in the future, yeah. And here's the backstory with that. I contacted him about a comics, like a writing job for a project that I was involved in. And, these guys they're just people. They're people like us. I mean, he's sort of semi-retired and, but he's a writer. He's well known. And then he said, hey, I love your art. You do like a kind of a Bronze Age 1970s, 60s, 70s style comic book illustration. So he said, you'd be perfect for this one, Conan 2000 type story, and he says, but we have to get approved by the Robert E. Howard estate. And I'm like, let's go for it. I thought this would be my big break. Can you imagine for a young comic book artist, like that would be a massive break. It was a dream come true. And he's like, well, here, I'll give you the phone number of the estate and give them a call and, tell them what we're doing, and then let me know what happens. And later on, I thought to myself, why are you having me call them? Why you're Robert, or you're Roy Thomas? Like, you've worked with them for years. I didn't put that together. I called, and there was a woman who, represented the estate, and she spoke to me, patiently listened to the pitch. And then she just like shredded me verbally in this very snobby, like, looking down her nose, like, the Robert E. Howard properties are blah de blah and poop de poo and poo poo on you, and just was like extremely rude to me, and that was the end of the conversation. So I got back to Roy Thomas and told him what happened. He was like, yeah, no, but Anyway, that's my brush with fame right there. It's okay. You know, I still got to meet Roy Thomas, you know.
That's really
So
cool.
it's kind of a funny story. There's a weird little side thingy here. You mentioned Solomon Kane.
Mm-hmm.
No, this is like how do I call it? Like he's a really cool character by Robert E. Howard that isn't really well known. Like I only, you know, the Robert E. Howard fans would know it, but he's nowhere as big as say Conan, for example.
Yeah.
And some years ago, I put together a little video of it's a Solomon Kane story with it's from like Marvel Comics. Robert E. Howard wrote a poem that is about Solomon Kane, and so I chopped up the artwork of the comic and I read the poem and put a little music behind it, but I did it with a Scottish accent to give it like that kind of pirate flavor to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm really not sure if it works or not, but I think I'm going to play it for the show right now, and just to give the show a little extra spice and do something kind of fun. So I'm going to hook that up in a second here, and it's probably just a couple minutes long. But what are your thoughts on Solomon Kane as the not so popular character?
I love Solomon Kane, man. Solomon Kane is as you mentioned, he's his lesser known character, and you know it's kind of hard to compete with Conan. You know, big
True.
jacked guy that is, whether you're into the first Conan stories or you get into the comics, which by the way, I was a big fan of the Savage Sword of Conan, which was drawn by Boris Vallejo. I don't know if everybody's seen that.
Oh yeah, Boris Vallejo is very famous in that field. Go ahead.
But Solomon Kane is just an excellent character. He had so many great stories. It's just it's a nice change. He's a little different than Conan. He's not quite Conan is very much self-serving, right? Conan, he doesn't really. He's just in it for the girls and the gold and the jewels and the violence and the fun and to do as much awesome stuff. Whereas Solomon Kane, he serves a purpose, right? He has like a code of ethics. He already his demons are behind him, and he's just a very interesting character. Robert E. Howard was just brilliant, and we're about to see with this. He was a brilliant poet as well.
Well, I think this is the perfect setup for this little production I put together. I do want to mention there is a Solomon Kane movie, and it's very dark, but it's very good. If people want to look that up somehow or somewhere, it's not.
Yeah, it's got the guy from the HBO Rome series in it.
You nailed it. He's fantastic on screen. He really he owns that character. It's just great to see something that's not like degenerate and demoralizing to our people. So let's take a minute here to look at Solomon Kane's Homecoming, a poem by Robert E. Howard. And you and I will put ourselves on mute, and away we go. The white gulls wheeled above the cliffs. The air was slashed with foam. The long tides moaned along the strand when Solomon Kane came home. He walked in silence strange and dazed through the little Devon town. His gaze like a ghost's came back to life, roamed up the streets and down. The people followed wonderingly to mark his spectral stare, and in the tavern silently they thronged about him there. He heard, as a man hears in a dream, the old worn rafters creak, and Solomon lifted his drinking jack and spoke as a ghost might speak. There sat Richard Grenville once, in smoke and flame he passed, and we were won to 53, but we gave them blast for blast. From crimson dawn to crimson dawn, we held the dons at bay. The deadly littered on our decks, our masts were shot away. We beat them back with broken blades, till crimson ran the tide. death thundered in the cannon smoke when Richard Grenville died. We should have blown our hull apart and sunk beneath the main. The people saw upon his wrists the scars of the racks of Spain. Where is Bess? Said Solomon Kane. Woe that I caused our tears. In the quiet churchyard by the sea she has slept these 7 years. The sea wind moaned at the window pane, and Solomon bowed his head. Ashes to ashes and dust to dust. The fairest fade, he said. His eyes were mystical deep pools that drowned unearthly things. And Solomon lifted up his head, spoke of his wanderings. Mine eyes have looked upon sorcery in the dark and naked lands, horror born of jungle gloom, and death on the pathless sands. And I have known a deathless queen in a city as old as death, where towering pyramids of skulls her glory witnesseth. Her kiss was like an adder's fang, with the sweetness Lilith had, and her red-eyed vassals howled for blood in that city of the mad. And I have slain a vampire shape that sucked a black king white, and I have roamed through grisly hills where dead men walked at night. And I have seen heads fall like fruit in a slaver's barracoon, and I have seen winged demons fly all naked in the moon. My feet are weary of wandering, and age comes apace. I fain would dwell in Devon, now forever in my place. The howling of the ocean pack came whistling down the gale, and Solomon Kane threw up his head like a hound that snuffs the trail. Adown the wind like a running pack the hounds of the oceans bayed, and Solomon Kane rose up again, girt his Spanish blade. In his strange cold eyes a vagrant gleam grew wayward and blind and bright, and Solomon put the papal by and went into the night. A wild moon rode the wild white clouds, and waves in white crests flowed, when Solomon Kane went forth again, and no man knew his road. They glimpsed him etched against the moon, where clouds on hilltop thinned. They heard an eerie, echoed call that whistled down the wind. And there you go. That was a project that I put together, and I really stuck my neck out there. I hope that it was okay.
That was cool. That
Cool.
was cool. I liked it.
I'm obviously totally enamored with that world, and like I love the again, I feel like it's very cinematic, you know, the and then to have it in poetry form is a whole unique thing in itself. So it's quite wonderful. So hats off to Robert E. Howard and to Solomon Kane. So let's talk a little bit about your influence from Heavy Metal Magazine.
Oh yeah.
Here we go.
Heavy Metal Magazine is which a lot of people will argue, and rightfully so, that Heavy Metal Magazine and kind of the universe of heavy metal was heavily inspired by pulp, and you can just see directly why. You know, from the art on the cover, from the themes that are in there, the kind of mashup. We mentioned about mashups of genres, sci-fi, fantasy, just whatever you can think of goes in there with Heavy Metal Magazine. There's aliens and demons and barbarians with laser guns and dinosaurs and all kinds of crazy stuff. The genre is what we would now call gonzo, which is refers to that there is really no epistemological warrant for anything being there. It's just whatever you could come up with at the top of your head and just turn it into most ridiculous, insane stuff. But my introduction to heavy metal was when they're still around a little bit, but here in rural Pennsylvania. Back in the 90s, we didn't really have malls, right? Malls or stores or whatever. We had what you would call a dirt mall or a flea market. Mm-hmm. And these flea markets, they would have very large outside areas where people would sell their wares. And then inside, there would be these makeshift kind of little shops that people would have. Mm-hmm. And there was quite a few shops that were, guys that would sell they would fix guitars, sell comic books, sell cassette tapes, and just have all kinds of just crazy cool stuff that guys like us would fall in love with. So I went there, and I remember it caught my eye. I was probably 12, right? I was probably 12, and I found there was he was selling these 2 packs of comic books and stuff that were a little bit damaged or whatever. He just wanted to get rid of them, and I saw Heavy Metal Magazine. And it said heavy metal real big on the front. And being a guy that grew up with, Ronnie James Dio and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and Black Sabbath, I was like, heavy metal. I love heavy metal. Yeah. The front of this has this big alien guy, and this other one has this, and I'm 12. So the one of the other one had this very scantily clad, voluptuous woman on the front. And, being a 12-year-old boy, you're a big fan of voluptuous women. You know what I mean? I'm probably still a fan, but back then it was a bigger deal, right? This was back before, kids had access to the internet. So I got these two magazines, and I remember I took them home, and I'm looking at them in the car on the way back. My dad was driving, and I'm like, this is so cool. This is awesome. And I remember my dad, he's like, I think they made a movie out of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And I was like, well, we got to check this out. So weeks later, we were at the video store. We had, this is before Blockbuster even. We had, I don't want to name the store, but there was a local video store where you go rent VHSs and stuff like that. And I remember I saw it there. It was like Heavy Metal, the movie. So we took it home, and I watched it with my dad and some of my buddies. We popped it into the VCR, and it was just it starts out with the Lochnar, that weird orb, and it's like this.
I have a copy of it. I've watched it hundreds of times, probably.
Oh yeah, I love it. Dude, I have it on my computer. I have it on my phone. Yeah. I've watched it a gazillion times. I love it. But it was just I loved it. It was there's so much cool music in it from Blue Oyster Cult, Sammy Hagar. The opening theme is so cool. There's cool cars in it and just hyper violence, and it's edgy, and it's it's a little degenerate, but not in a bad way. It's degenerate it's not really degenerate. It's risque, I guess you could say.
That's the thing. See, no, I mean, I think of degenerate as almost it's so leftist now that I associate it with, whereas this was very, very edgy, and I mean, it had a science fiction kind of protest mentality to it in some way. There was a lot of sort of Blade Runner in it, whatever the flavor of that is, visions of the future dystopia, but always kind of struggling to kind of find the humanity in different things. And then the art is just dripping with amazement. It's totally off the charts.
Magnificent.
Yeah. Just that alone is it just takes you to these other places where you're kind of wow, what other world is this? And it's immersive. It's deeply immersive. People kind of have to think that, there was a time where there was no internet, and you had books and movies and comics, and I know for maybe people who grew up with, say, video games, etc., that's probably boring or something like that. But if that's all you had, it would mean so much more, because people are so overstimulated with the media that we have today that they can't sort of appreciate this, I think. And maybe I'm wrong. I don't want to be like an old fuddy-duddy, talking like that. I hope that's generally not true. But I feel like if, when people realize that, we didn't have that kind of overstimulated media, that this was it. And then not only that, this kind of media stood out against everything else that was out there that was just sort of, ordinary stuff, your Spider-Man comics or this or that. It's obviously adult. Now, my little story, my dad would ask me to join him, say like, I have to go to the, what do you call it? Go to the, like the place where you go, like a drugstore of some kind, right? And there would be a magazine section there. And he'd say, yeah, go, here's $1, go grab yourself some comics. It just kept me busy while he was doing his little shopping stuff. And I came across this magazine, Heavy Metal. And of course, it's got some kind of extremely exotic and sexy looking snake woman or something in this like other planet,
Yeah.
And she's scantily clad. And I'm like, whoa, oh my God. Okay. And I look around, is anybody watching? Okay. And then I kind of, sneak and I open it up, and then kabang, all this adult illustration is in there. And I'm like, it changed my world. Again, you also consider I'm a young budding artist, I'm growing, I'm, coming of age, and like the timing of this, mind blowing. So I thought, okay, I'm going to bring this up and I'll hand it to my dad, throw it on the counter with the other stuff. And hopefully he won't read the little words in the subtitle that says Adult Illustrated Magazine, and he'll, now he might have seen it and then just kind of looked the other way and said, it's healthy, that kind of thing. But that was the sort of the beginning of my, my foray into heavy metal. So, and I still collect them. I've got like numerous heavy metal magazines, and whenever I go to Comic Cons, that's actually my mission. I'm always looking in like the old sections to try to find these old magazines. As an artist, again, the level of illustration is extraordinary, and I'm stealing stuff. I'm like, okay, how do they do the anatomy here? Look at this composition. Look at this guy's style. How do I say show light and rendering in this situation? What's a good way to color this particular scene, et cetera, et cetera. And then of course I'm writing a lot of my own stories. So maybe I should submit a story to your magazine. I think I would actually call on the White Art Collective to maybe think about that as well. Now we've on Imperium Art, we've interviewed a few authors as well. So I think I'll get the word out to those guys as well. And my hope is that somehow or other I could do some illustrations inside future issues. So
that would be wonderful.
Yeah, because it's like I say, that's kind of that's the stuff I sort of grew up on. So it would just be an amazing pleasure to be able to do that,
Yeah, that would be excellent.
Awesome. So the Bizarchives, this is a incredible new book of short stories put out by Dave Martel. Do you have a name for your publishing company?
Right now we're just going by the Bizarchives. We're actually going to go. We're actually getting the legal stuff in order. This is sold so well that I'm going to have to like figure out my taxes.
Yeah, that's a good problem.
I didn't know it was going to sell this well, but I'm going to go. We're going to get the taxes worked out. It's going to become an official thing. I got business cards in the works. Bizarchives, publishers of weird fiction. We also have the Midgard Institute, which is it's like a learning platform for guys to go, and they also do a poetry thing, and there's lots of stuff behind it. But the Bizarchives, we have the standard Bizarchives, and then we also have two other series. We have Bizarchives Presents and Bizarchives Classics. And the first two Bizarchives Presents are going to be, I believe it's going to be coming out in September or November, or October or November, and it's going to be Dredge. and Dredge is a short story by A. Cuthbertson, one of our authors that was in the first Bizarchives. He's the author of Tanner's Gold, and Dredge is an English story, an English cosmic horror about a group of tough guys that get hired as bodyguards for this Dutch prospector that's trying to drain these English bogs, and then they uncover something that's so terrifying that it's like an apocalyptic scale. It's a really great story. It's really short. It's a novella, so it's about 20,000 words. So anybody that's like that doesn't really have time for a big commitment on a story, Dredge is right up your alley. It's moves very quickly, lots of action, spooky. It's really great story. Dredge is coming out. The second Bizarchives Presents is going to be The Sacred Times, which is an 8-part novel series from our author M.S. Jones, which is there's not enough time to explain the whole story. It's this grand epic fantasy, kind of in the vein of a Lord of the Rings kind of thing, but it's a little bit different. It's his style. So that's going to be coming out. And then we have a few 3 publications coming out from Bizarchives Classics. Since we are doing pulp fiction, I could not let the old pulp stories that are in free domain that people haven't seen in a long time just sit there. So I went through, and the first one coming out on the Bizarchives Classics is going to be called Lost Tales Issue 1. And Lost Tales is a compilation of short stories written by guys that either submitted to pulp magazines anonymously or used a pen name that could never be traced back to a person. And some of these stories are really obscure. And so there's one that's out of a pulp magazine that was from Australia from like 1905 and like really obscure stuff. And that's going to be coming out, and there's some really cool stories in there. Stories that haven't seen the light of day in 100 years or more. Wow. So we're putting that out there. And then also we have a pretty cool one. I found actually, I'm not going to reveal it. People are just going to have to wait.
Okay. All right. See, this is the beautiful thing. I'm so excited to be able to share with our audience here and the world, like what you're doing, that I can see in the coming months and years, probably this is going to blow up and expand. So I can't tell you how happy that you're doing this, and I can't wait to be a part of it. We do have a question from the audience.
Sure.
A friend of mine, Ulfric Durenson, has asked, Dave, will you have any copies at the upcoming festival that you've been promoting?
Focus Summer Hollowing. Yeah. I'm actually donating a signed copy. There's going to be a copy that's signed by me and one of the other authors. And we are donating it to the Urban Folk raffle that's going to be at the Focus Summer Hollowing. Okay. I did not. I didn't have enough time to gather enough copies for an inventory to come sell copies, unfortunately. But we are donating a signed copy to the raffle. So folks that they can, if they go to the Focus Summer Hollowing, you guys that are going to be there, do the raffles, get your tickets for the raffle, and then hopefully you can get your very own signed copy of Bizarchives signed by yours truly.
Brilliant, brilliant. So where can people find out more about you and this festival, events and shows that relate to you and the work that you do?
Well, this event it's going to be this weekend, and it's in Pennsylvania. So if folks are in Pennsylvania, you're not doing nothing this weekend, go to FocusSummerHollowing.com and you can go get tickets and go check it out. It's like the biggest heathen event on the East Coast. It's really excellent. There's like archery and boxing classes, and there's a mead tasting contest, and all just like there's a bouncy castle for the kids, and there's this big ritual where Mike from the Ermin Folk, he actually builds a large like a replica of a Germanic ship, like a Viking ship, and they set it on fire and push it out into the water. I haven't gotten to see it yet in person, but it's pretty cool. It's a pretty popular thing.
Yeah, that's crazy. I just bought tickets to the Celtic Festival where I live. It's for my son and I. That's exciting. So, wow, so much culture, so much promise for the future. I'm really elated to have you on the show and to announce all these things with you. This has been a super fun conversation. You and I could nerd out for hours. I hope that the audience yeah, I hope the audience enjoyed that. I hope my Scottish accent wasn't too off-putting. My ancestors.
I thought it was good.
Okay, yeah. And again, share, subscribe, comment, like, get those algorithms going, get involved in these cultural things. Our arts community is really, really rich and alive. So, but we need you to share the content that we're doing. So God bless you. Thank you so much for everyone in the audience. And Dave, thank you so much for spending time with us today on American Zarathustra.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, brother.